How to build a 12 GPU mining rig. Here you can see the hardware that I'm going to be using to build this mining rig. I'm going to be using the SUPoX 12 GPU mining motherboard. Same motherboard as the TB250-BTC Pro 12 GPU board. Then I'm going to be using 6 AMD Powercolor Golden Sample Red Devil 588GB cards. And I'm going to be powering those with a 1300 G2 EVGA power supply. I'm also going to be using 6 MSI p106 100 NVIDIA mining cards and powering those with a 1000 G2 EVGA power supply. I've chosen to use the G3900 Intel Celeron CPU, a Galaxy 128GB SATA 3 SSD, and I'm going to be using 2 sticks of 4GB DDR4 Micron RAM. And then to connect the 2 power supplies, I'm going to be using a dual PSU cable. I also have 2 8GB RAM sticks for a total of 16GB. So at first I'll try with 8GB, and then if I do think that I run into any issues, I'll try with 16GB. I also have 2 16GB sticks on the way, so I'll also be testing with a total of 32GB in the near future. This video will be the first part of a series. I will be switching up the GPUs and testing 12 NVIDIA cards and then 12 AMD cards. I'm going to be using one of my SilverZodiac 12 GPU mining rig frames. As you can see, it's already set up with risers. I've got 8 Sata risers and 4 Molex risers. And I'm going to be using the 3500 RPM fans, one that I've connected together with red connectors, and one that I've connected together with black connectors. So let's get on with the build. Here's the motherboard. I'll release the latch and open up the socket. And I'll insert my G3900 Celeron CPU. I'm going to be using the stock cooler that comes with the G3900. So I'll stick that on. I'll push the 4 pins down, make sure that they're locked into place. And then I'll connect the fan to the CPU fan header on the motherboard. And then kind of just get those wires out of the way. Now I'll take my sticks of DDR4 memory and insert those into the RAM slots on the motherboard. I would recommend at least using 8GB. You can go higher and try to use 16 or even 32GB. Biostar does recommend using 16GB for 6 cards and 32GB for 12 cards. Others here in China are recommending a minimum of 8GB of RAM, and they say 16GB would be better. But again, 8GB has been working for me in general, so I'm going to try that. I tried with 16, I found no difference. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to screw the SSD onto the mining rig frame. So I've got my mining rig frame here on the side. It's easier to screw the SSD in if the frame is upright like this. Now that the SSD is in, I'll go ahead and I'll mount the motherboard and screw the motherboard onto the frame. plug the SATA 3 cable into the SSD and then into the motherboard. Now that I'm done mounting the motherboard, I'll put the PSUs onto the frame. First, I'll put down these little PSU stands. I've got a little bit of electrical tape on the back so that they stick to the bottom of the frame. I'm going to slide the 1000 G2 in first. And then screw that one in from the back. And then I'll stick the 1300 G2 in and screw that in. All of my cables are already attached to the power supplies. So I'll take my dual power supply cable. I'm going to use the 1300 G2 as the primary and the 1000 G2 as the secondary. I'll go ahead and I'll plug a SATA cable into my SSD. And I'll just kind of tidy that up a little bit, put a plastic tie around it. That'll help get that cable out of the way. And then I'll go ahead and I'll plug the CPU cable into the motherboard. Now I'll take all of the Sata and Molex cables from the 1000 G2 and plug them into the risers. Each of these risers will be powered by their own cable. Now that that's done, I'll go ahead and I'll slot my GPUs. I'm going to be putting the Nvidia GPUs on this bottom row. Now they're all slotted, I'll go ahead and I'll plug a 6-pin from a VGA cable from the 1000 G2 into each graphics card. And now I'll screw down the graphics cards so that they stay in place. Now that that's done, I'll go ahead and plug in the Sata and Molex cables into my risers that are going to be for my 580. I'm going to double up on two of the Sata risers here because I've used one of those Sata cables for the SSD. Now that's done, I'll go ahead and slot the Red Devil 580s. Screw them into place as I'm slotting them. These are much heavier cards than the p106s, so I wanted to make sure that they were secure and in their place before I tried to push the power cables in. Now I'm done the first three, I'll go ahead and do the last three. Now that they're screwed in, I'm going to plug power cables into all of them. Just like my 8 GPU build, I've taken extra 8 plus 6 pin VGA cables. I'm going to be using those. Now you don't have to use the 6 pin power on the graphics cards. You can just connect an 8 pin to the 8 pins on the graphics card. It will work fine. I've done that with one of my other Devils before. Now they're all done, I'll kind of just tidy up the cables a little bit, use some zip ties, try to do a little bit of cable management. Still going to look like a mess because there's so many cables, but just to get them somewhat organized will help a lot. So now that I've got all of my cables managed as well as I can, I'm going to mount the fans onto the frame. Slide that into position, and then I'll tighten down the 4 corner screws. First set of fans are mounted, so I'll go ahead and mount the second set. Last, I'll plug in a power and reset switch and LEDs. And here's what it looks like with all of the risers plugged in. Now, when I first installed Windows, I did take out a bunch of these risers, but you can leave them in. You can have all 12 in there when you're installing Windows. It's no problem. It will work. So here you can see it has posted. So I'll just go over the BIOS settings quickly. When you do get this board, you're going to want to make sure that the language is on English. That is, unless you can read Chinese. And you should change mining mode to above 6 times VGA. Now that is pretty much all that you have to do in order to get this to work properly, but I'll go ahead and I'll show you some of the other settings that I've changed and some of the settings that Biostar does recommend that you change. In PCH I/O configuration, click on PCI Express configuration, and in here you can change all the one-time slots, gen type. I've used Gen 1 and Gen 2, both seem to work fine for me. And then in System Agent, I changed the primary display to PEG. Above 4G does not have to be enabled in order to get this to work properly. It will work without it enabled. And at the bottom, you can change the 16 time slot to Gen 1 or Gen 2. Now I did set virtual memory to a minimum of 16 gigabytes and a maximum of 32 gigabytes in Windows. The RAM requirements may change if I change to 12 NVIDIA cards or 12 AMD cards or change to Linux, so I'll have to wait and see and test those out. And here's the first test. I'm running Claymore Zcash miner and EWBF Zcash miner, each with 6 cards, 6 AMD cards on Claymores and 6 NVIDIA cards on EWBFs, and it runs flawlessly. No problems whatsoever. Now, where I did run into problems was with Claymore's Ethereum miner. When I tried to launch it with all of the cards, it would just freeze up and freeze the entire system. When I tried to launch it with just 6 AMD cards, it would also just freeze up and freeze up the whole system, crash the system. So what I had to do to actually get it to work was to break those AMD cards up into 3 and then another 3 plus 4 NVIDIA cards. And because of the limitations of the devices that you can use on Claymore's Ethereum miner with the /DI switch, you can only get up to 10 GPUs working at most. So here I've got 3 AMD GPUs in the first miner, and then I've got 3 AMD GPUs and 4 NVIDIA GPUs mining in the second miner that's open. On the bottom, I've put the last 2 NVIDIA cards mining Zcash with EWBFs just to make use of them. Now, I tried to install Windows numerous times, including without updates, with updates. I've tried different AMD drivers, including the newest ones, the mixed drivers as seen in my previous video, and nothing got these AMD cards to work 6 at a time when the NVIDIA cards were installed. If I didn't have the NVIDIA cards installed and just the AMD cards, the miner would run flawlessly. It would see all 6 AMD cards, launch up, it wouldn't freeze, and it would mine. But once I had those NVIDIA cards in there, it didn't want to work properly. This is the only way that I could get it to work properly, that I could get it to actually mine. I also tried with 16 gigabytes of RAM, that didn't help. I tried to plug in the Molex connectors into the motherboard, and again, that didn't help. The 6 AMD cards would still not run in Claymore's Ethereum miner properly. So I'm going to try and do further testing, and we'll see how well this works on the ASRock board coming up very soon. And hopefully in Linux, it does work better. I'm going to try with all AMD cards and all NVIDIA cards in Linux in upcoming videos this weekend. So stay tuned to check those out. And since my wife tells me that I'm 5 years old, if you want to see somebody a little bit older than me and probably much more mature, you can check out JackPlays123 and his 6 GPU TB250 build. I'll put a link to his channel in the description. Be sure to go there, check it out, give him your thoughts on his build, give him some likes, and I'm sure he'll really appreciate it. So I hope you liked the video, I hope it helped, and thanks for watching.